recording. And if any questions come up while I'm going over stuff, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm happy to re-go over anything that we need to go over. So I'm going to leave Blackboard here for now and go over to my glitch site. So I logged in before class this time, so I wouldn't have any issues with that, but it seems to be working okay today. And so I'm just going to go to my recent projects, MMP 310, three.js demo, and I'm going to go to edit the project. And I'll share a link to this in the voice channel chat if you want to take a look. And remember, you can always remix a project if you want to start from wherever I am with the code. Um, so let's see. We've kind of got a lot of code going on now. We may have to, next week we'll do some more kind of like code organizational stuff so that we're not just looking at a crazy huge block of code all the time. But for now, let's just review what we've done so far. So we have our basic setup where we create the scene and the camera and position the camera in the scene, and we create the renderer and we add the controls. So that's pretty typical for any P5 project. You're going to see setting up a scene, camera, renderer, and controls. Now we start to actually build the scene here. So we made the ground. We made some clouds, and with our clouds, we used a loop. So we reviewed loops and made this for loop to create 1,000 clouds. And then to create the clouds, we used a lot of just random math. So I had a random radius between 0 and 10, a geometry for the cloud, an icosahedron geometry that takes a random radius and a detail of 1. And then our cloud material, which is just a basic material with a color, which is that white color. Then we create our mesh, which is a combination of the geometry and the material. And I'm not doing a very good job of using the three.js convention of adding spaces in between my parentheses, which is not what I normally do, but that's what they do, so I'm going to try to do that. And then we created an X, Y, and Z to position the cloud. And so each cloud that we make out of the 1,000 clouds has a random position. And then we just set the cloud position based on the X, Y, Z. And I got to add some spaces here. And then we add our cloud to the scene. And then I was just demonstrating something here. I'm going to take that out. And then down here we have our animate function, which renders our scene. I'm going to put a little comment here because this is kind of a separate part. Animation. So that's where we render our scene. Okay, so we're going to add some lighting and materials first. So I'm going to make a new position, new area for this, and it's going to go between the setup area and the scene area. It doesn't really matter what order these things happen in, but I'm just going to put them in between here. So I'm going to have lighting here, and then the materials are actually added to the object, so that we'll just start with the lighting. And so then I'm going to click on my preview button here and preview in a new window. And here's my app that I've got so far. I've got the ground and I've got my clouds. And I'm just going to start adding some new stuff in here. And let's get the console open. So for Windows, I just hit Control-Shift-J to open the console. For Mac, it's Option Command J, I think. And so here we go. I've got my scene, I've got my controls so I can look around. And we're going to see adding lighting in here is really going to make this look a lot more interesting. And so let's get started with that. So when we go over to three.js, if I go to the examples and I type in lighting, or maybe it's just lights. Okay, so if I type in lights, we'll see the different types of lights that we can use in three.js. Um, so the hemisphere light is going to add sort of lighting from the top and the bottom that's meant to kind of recreate the light that we have on the Earth. There's light that comes up from the sun and then light that's reflected from the ground. Um, and so we can see that here if we toggle the hemisphere light no, and we look at the shading on this flamingo animation, you can see with the directional light, that adds a lot of light from the top. But when we toggle that off and we just have the hemisphere light, you can see the lighting on the bottom is actually a little bit brighter than the lighting on the top because of the position of the animation. So we'll add one of those. Um, and then if we take them both of them off, we see that, what happens when there's no light at all. And this also has a sky background, which is something that we may want to add in the future to add kind of a background to our scene. So then this example is physical lighting. This is like fancier lighting that's kind of like new. And so you can see there's a lot of detail and shadows with these lighting. But there's a bit more of a performance um, hit when you use fancy lighting like this. So one thing that I may not have pointed out is if you look in the top left of all these examples, there's a little FPS render meter, which shows you how fast the animation is running. And it's trying to run at 60 frames per second. So the computer I'm on is not like the nicest computer in the world. So it doesn't surprise me that it's not hitting 60 FPS. But you can basically see the performance of these different scenes. So 41 FPS it's not too bad for an animation. You wouldn't want to run a game at 40 FPS. So that's not super great, but it's okay. For this physical lighting, you can see the FPS actually drops down a bit. It's around 30 FPS. So again, it's okay for an animation, but it's, you know, the more stuff you're doing in a 3D scene, the more the performance is going to lag a little bit. Here's an example of point lights. And so these are lights that just have uh, like a specific position in the scene, and the light emanates from that position, and it only emanates like a certain distance. And so in this example, we see the different color lights are only illuminating parts of this model that they're nearby. Spotlight, this shines light in a specific direction. This light actually has like a map or texture on it, so that's why we get this sort of texture here. But we can turn it to none and we'll just get a regular light. And we can see the shadow that comes off the object. And you can change the color of the light. You can change the intensity, so it can be very more or less bright, and also the distance, how far the light travels, the angle, or how wide the spotlight is. I don't know what penumbra means. Let's see. Oh, that's how much it kind of we get that gradient from the edges. And then the decay is how far the light falls off. And then focus, I guess determines, let's see. It looks like it is really only affecting the shadow. I guess that's how far the shadows go out. I'm not really sure. And then we can turn shadows on and off. Um, and then an area light is just to evenly distributes light over an area, and you can give it like a shape. So this is a rectangle, so we can see the different lights here affecting the object. So in the very middle where the lights are combining, it's very bright, it's almost white. And then on the edges where the lights are separated, we see those colors, the green and red and blue. So we can get a lot of different effects through using different types of lighting in our scene. So let's go over to the docs and add some lights. Um, so I'm going to actually just type in light, and I think that'll show me more of my lights. Okay, so the most basic light that we're going to start with is an ambient light, and this just puts a certain amount of light in the entire scene everywhere. And most scenes have kind of a soft ambient light in them. so that you can see stuff if you're using materials that reflect light. Right now, we're actually not using materials that reflect light, so we're going to have to add in the ambient light, and then we're going to add in some new materials. So lighting and materials, when it comes to 3D graphics, are very, very interrelated. You can't really have one without the other. Um, so let's add our light in, and we won't really see much difference, but then we're going to add in some materials, and then we'll see how they affect the scene. So I'm just going to copy this code in my ambient light example, and I'll put a link to this in the chat. Okay, so I'll copy the code here. And so for my lighting, I'm just going to put a light here. And it's called light, which all of these examples are going to be called light. And so that's going to get kind of confusing. So we're going to give it a different name for the variable. I'm just going to call this one ambient. And so I'll take out that ambient and paste it here so that matches. And this is a soft white light. If I want to see what the color this really is, I might want to get like a color picker. So I can just Google color picker and it'll show up here. And I can paste those values into my hex value and that'll kind of show me the color there. So if if that works, that's good. If you want a color with more hue, you could move this around and then replace the hex value. So for an ambient light, depending on what kind of like temperature you want your scene, you may want to kind of adjust this. So I'll just stick with what they have and we can change it later. But that's how we would change that if we wanted to. It just takes this color here and it's going to evenly distribute the light across the scene. So when we first reload our scene, we're not going to see any difference at all because we're just using basic materials. But if we replace these materials, then we'll see that the light interacts with the materials that we're using. So I'm going to open up a new tab and open up a new three.js documentation window, and we're going to look at some materials. So I'm going to type in materials in the examples first. And so here is a nice example with all the different types of materials. And so materials determine how light interacts with the surface of an object. And so you can see there's like different qualities of these different materials. Some of them look kind of flat. Some of them look more dimensional. Some of them look shiny. Some of them look dull. So these materials kind of are trying to replicate how things look in the real world. So let's look at some more materials. Um, I want to see the types of materials. We're not really seeing the types of materials. Okay. Hmm. Oh, here we go. This is what I want to see. Okay. So this is our basic material. Um, they don't really, they're just kind of like a color. They might be shiny or dull, but they don't really interact with light. You can see that light moving around in the scene, that little circle that's hovering around, but it doesn't actually change anything. So that's what we have right now. We have basic materials, and that's why the color always stays the same. So a Lambert is kind of the first type of lighting algorithm that was created for 3D graphics. And so it's a default that you'll see in a lot of libraries. It has a pretty specific effect, which you can see there's these kind of like banding and rings around the objects. So as you see the light move around, you can see sort of the directionality of the light and how the light interacts with the material. So these materials over here are very dull, whereas the materials on this side have a bit more shininess to them. And so we can see all the different variations of these different materials. A Phong material is a slightly newer algorithm for uh, creating the light, and you can see it has this like very shiny. It has a lot more shininess here, and then there's a much more of a visible kind of like gradient or decay from the shiniest part to the darker part of the material. So that's a Phong material. And then most of the time what we use these days is a standard material. A lot of 3D graphics libraries have basically their own standard material, which may be some kind of custom algorithm, which you could probably, we can, since it's an open source library, we could look at the code and try to figure out what it is. But it's going to have a lot of different properties that we can work with. So this is probably what we'll stick with for now. And we can see how these different objects look with the standard material. So again, basically we're working with the same things, like there's shininess versus dullness, and then how the light kind of drops off from the most intense point to the rest of the object. There's also toon materials, which are meant to look more like cartoons. They're not meant to look like, the real world. And so there's a flat shading effect that happens, which is a cool effect. I actually really like toon materials. So that's another one that you can use if you're going for what we usually call non-photorealistic rendering. So it's not meant to look like the real world, but it is still using the light data to create depth and detail. So yeah, there's a lot of other materials that we could look at, but we're just gonna stick with the standard material for now. And if we go back to the docs and look at our standard material, we can see the properties for the mesh standard material. So here's this example, and there's a whole lot of properties. And so in this scene, we can change the lighting and stuff like that. But let's just look at the material. So we have the emissive color, and so a material can actually like glow if you want it to glow a little bit to produce light. And so you can add an emissive color, and you can see now it will produce light that'll reflect off of other objects, but usually we just want the emissive to be completely black. Then the roughness is how much it reflects or how shiny it is. So if I turn the roughness all the way off, you can see there's these highlights from the light. And if I turn it all the way up to 1, we get this dull, rough material. And then the metalness is how it reflects light. So if I make it really shiny, if I turn the roughness all the way down and then turn the metalness all the way up, you start to see that kind of like metal quality. And then we can do flat shading. So that shows us the actual vertexes. We can turn on the wireframe if we want. We can show the vertex colors, which we probably don't want to do. We can tell it to either interact with fog or not. And then this stuff down here, we probably won't get into today. Maybe the map, which is like a texture. If we want to put a texture on here, we can use the map. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with the material. We're going to try to keep things kind of simple for today. Let's see if we have an example with some code down here. No, that's okay. So we're just gonna put the constructor in place of the material that we already have. So I'm gonna take the mesh standard material, I'm gonna copy this, and I'm gonna add it to my clouds. So I'm gonna go back to my script and scroll down a bit. And here's the material that I used for my cloud. And so you can see the mesh basic material here. I'm just gonna paste in the mesh standard material and save. Oh, I don't need to save, as Glitch always reminds me. And now when we refresh the page, we'll see that the clouds are kind of gray. And that's because right now in the scene, we only have ambient light. And so the only light that's reflecting off the clouds is that ambient light. If I took that light out, so if I go back here and I'm just going to quickly comment out the ambient light and then refresh, we're not going to see the clouds at all. Um, what we do see is the silhouette of the clouds because they still exist and they cover up our ground, but we don't see the actual color of the clouds because there's no light in the scene. So it's good to use an ambient light just to give you kind of a baseline so you can see stuff, but that's not going to be the main light that we use in our scene. So let's add a couple more lights. We'll start with a hemisphere light, which will give us a nice kind of up and down light that'll give us kind of the sense of, light in the real world. So let's go to hemisphere lights. Um, and this one, let's see. So there's the sky color, which is a hex value. the ground color, which is a different hex value, and then the intensity, how bright the light is, and that's going to be on a scale from 0 to 1. So let's grab this light. So I'm just going to copy that code and I'm going to paste it in here. And again, notice that it still just uses light for the example, so we need to change this to something specific. So I'm going to just call this hemi, short for hemisphere, and paste this in here. And let's reload the scene. And now we can see the default here is actually not so bad. Like now our clouds look a lot more like real clouds, right? Because they have a dark bottom and a light top. And if you look up at the clouds, I'm actually looking out the window now and there's not a ton of clouds out, but I can see some. And you'll see that the top is highlighted because that's, it's facing the sun. And the bottom is in shadow because it's obviously, behind the top of the cloud. So we're already getting some nice effects from our hemisphere light. Um, and yeah, we don't really have, maybe we need to add some more stuff to the scene before we add more lights, but we can see a couple of those basics already. And if I adjust the light, so as you add more light into the scene, the colors that you see on your objects become sort of a combination of all of these different lights. And so our cloud material is just white, and our ambient light is just gray, and our hemisphere light is whatever these colors are. Let's see, let's look at what those colors are. So the first one is, let's throw that in the color picker. So it's like a very pale yellow. So that makes sense for the sun. And our second color is a very dark blue. Okay, so that's kind of nice for that, for reflecting kind of on the bottom of these clouds, that dark blue. But if we change our colors, like let's change actually our ambient light. So what if we wanted like a cooler scene? We might use like a light blue for the ambient light. So I'm gonna choose this color here and just copy that, and I'll go up to my ambient light and I'm going to put a comment here so I don't forget what the default is. And I'm just going to replace that light here. And so now I'll reload. Okay, and so everything in the scene is much brighter now, so I probably made it too bright. But yeah, you can see the effect of changing that ambient light changes all of our colors. So let's add another material to our ground and see how that changes things. I'm going to put the default back for the ambient light because I think it's a little too bright with that ambient light. Okay, this looks good. So let's add a mesh standard material for our ground. So here's my ground and here's the material. And instead of mesh basic material, I'm just going to replace this with a mesh standard material. And so now we see the ground is a little bit, the color hasn't changed that much, but it's a little different. And then what we can add for our ground also is like a texture. So that's another component of a material that we can use to add basically like an image into our material. And so that'll be the last little bit that we can do with our materials. So for our image, I'm going to need to use an image file. Let's actually look up textures real quick on three.js. So let's go to examples first, and I'll go to texture. And so here's our textures. So here's an example of some different textures. Basically, you just upload an image and it uses the texture as part of the material, but it also still interacts with light, and so that will affect how the texture looks. Let's see if there are any examples. Um, yeah, these are different textures with different filters on them. Let's see. I think that's good. We can just go to adding a texture. So let's go to the docs and look at textures. So we have to actually load the texture. So let's look at texture here. So there's a couple extra steps here. We have to load the texture and then set the wrapping and then the repeat. So with a mesh, when we have a texture, it usually is going to wrap around that mesh. And so we use these to determine how it's going to wrap. I really don't change these defaults very often. They usually work pretty well. But that's basically what we want to do. So then we got to decide what type of texture we're going to use. So a lot of the time you can design your own texture. You can go into Photoshop and make something, but you can also find textures on the internet pretty easily. There's a lot of 3D textures. And since we're doing the ground, if I do like 3D texture ground, you'll see if you go to Google Images, you're going to see a lot of different examples. And one thing I want to make sure I do when I'm grabbing images from the web is make sure that they are Creative Commons. So I'm going to go to Usage Rights under Tools and go to Creative Commons License. So this basically lets me know that I can use these things for free. And so we have some ground textures here. I don't love these textures really, so I'm going to try something else. Let's try grass. Okay, this is more close to what I want. Um, so let's just use this first one. But this is like if we want sort of like realism. I'm going to click on this and download it. Um, Actually, I probably want like a square texture. Although this looks like it's really big. I don't know if I want that much data. Um, let's see if there's a smaller version of this. Well, this website is kind of janky. Okay, I'm just going to download this. So I'm going to click, let's just right click and save image as. I could also just get a link to this. Let's copy link address. Oh, no, it's not the image itself. Okay, let's do open image in new tab. So you could just link directly to where this image is on the internet. But if it ever disappeared, then it would break your project. So I'm going to save this to my computer, and then I'm going to upload it to my glitch project. And so that's a realistic texture. We can take a look at what that looks like. But for designing a 3D scene, unless you're going to spend like a crazy amount of time on the lighting and making everything look good, a lot of the time, simpler textures are good for this. So another type of texture that can be really good for just a simple surface for some detail is like a noise texture. Actually, we don't need a 3D noise texture. We just need a noise texture. And so if we look at noise textures, you're going to see a lot of stuff like this. It's just kind of like detail to fill in, so it's not just like one blank color everywhere. And it actually makes things look a lot nicer. So there's a lot of different types of noise here. I tend to, if I'm working on my own project, I would make my own noise in like Photoshop or something. But for the grass, I'm just going to choose some basic noise. This is actually from Wikipedia, and that looks pretty good. Actually, I kind of like this one. It's a bit noisier. So I'm going to use this one. I'm going to open image in new tab, and I'm going to save this. So let's save this to my downloads. And so now I have two new textures to work with. Let's see. Okay. So I have to upload those to my glitch project. So I'm going to go to Files and add a file. So I'm going to upload. I wonder if it'll let me do two at the same time. No. Okay. So I'm going to upload this one first. And upload this one now. Um, huh. Didn't really show up. Are they under my JS folder? No. Files, upload a file, noise. I wonder if I'm getting like an error. Add file is not a function. That's not good. Okay, let's refresh and see if it'll work. Okay, add, upload a file, noise texture. Oh boy. Okay, so I can't upload a file. Maybe we can add a license file. Wow, okay. I'm getting more and more disappointed with glitch as I continue to use it. Let's try reloading it one more time. Files, upload a file, open, no. Okay. Um, Assets, upload an asset. Oh, maybe I just need to upload assets instead of files. Okay, open. Okay, that's good. So we have some assets. Oh, maybe it only lets me upload scripts here, and assets have to go here. Okay, so we uploaded an asset, and let's copy the URL. Okay. Okay, so if we want to upload something that's not a script or an HTML file, we need to use assets. And when you upload an asset, it looks like it adds it to a CDN, which is here. And we can just copy this. Can I rename it? I don't really need to do that. Let's just copy the URL. And so now I'll go back to my script, and I'm just going to paste in the URL as a variable so I don't have to remember it. So under my ground, I'm going to say const noise texture URL, and this is a string, so I'm going to put quotation marks, and there we go. So now I don't have to remember that thing. And then I have my grass texture URL. And so let's go back to assets and click on the grass and copy that URL. And now I'll go back to script.js and paste this in. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now if we want to add these textures, we have to load them first. So let's go back to our texture code and just copy and paste this. So I'm going to copy and paste in here. And so now instead of loading this texture slash water, we just have to load the URL that we want. So I'm going to start with the realistic grass texture. And I'm going to leave these defaults. And now to add the texture to my material, all I have to do, here's my material for my ground here. I have the color, I have the side, and now I just have to add the map. The map is what we use for the main texture in a material. So I'm going to save that and go ahead and go back and take a look. Whoops. Okay, so let's reload the scene. Okay, so there's our grass texture. Okay, so obviously looking at it, it's way too big, and so we will tweak those settings. Although we could also move our clouds and change things around, but there we go. That's our grass texture if we want to use the realistic grass. You can see though for something like this, it's very obvious that the grass is just kind of flat. So I don't know. It kind of depends on what you're going for. Maybe that's like kind of funny, but I usually use non-realistic textures. So if we want it to be smaller, we just change this repeat value and make it bigger. So if I say like 16 by 16, so I just increased it by 4 or multiplied by 4. Now you can see the texture is smaller, and so we get more texture. So you can play with that to get the right thing that you want. But I kind of prefer the noise texture as I mentioned, so I'm just going to replace this with the noise texture URL and then reload. And you'll see this just is going to add some detail to our scene, but it's not realistic, so it doesn't look sort of like kind of fake like the grass does. This texture actually, I wish I hadn't done the darker color because it looks a little too dark. But I'm just going to stick with this for now. And I'm going to set the repeat back to 4 by 4. I think that'll look better. Oh, it's kind of like filtering. Let me see if there's a way to not filter. Let's see. Okay, so we can change the filter here if we don't want it to be like that. Let's see. Anything else? Okay, so let's give this a try. So if the filtering is like what's making it look kind of like blurry in between the pixels. And again, it's kind of a matter of preference. You might think that looks fine. But I want to see if
Wait,
I can fix
Professor,
it. Yeah.
can you go over again the how do I add the texture to the ground?
Yes. Sorry. Just this part. Which part do you want me to go over again?
Oh, with the URL. Like when I add mine,
Hmm.
I do like constant and then I put the texture and then it does HTTPS and then colon and then it has like two slashes. So the rest of the URL just goes like a comment instead of
Oh, so you're missing the quotation marks.
uh
So if your URL looks like this, it's going to create an error because this is not like a variable or anything. This has to go, this is a string because it's a piece of data. So it has to go inside quotation marks. So you need a quotation mark at the beginning and a quotation mark at the end. And that should fix it.
okay.
Okay. All right. So we have our texture. I'm just going to leave that for now. I think it could look better, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now because there's other things that we can do. But I'm going to blow it back up a little bit. Maybe I'll actually go back to 16 by 16 because I don't really want it to be that noticeable. I just want it to be kind of like a subtle amount of detail on the ground. So yeah, that looks okay. I'm going to move my clouds up a bit. Let's see. Here's my cloud Y. I'm going to move them up to 50. Okay. So that looks a bit better. Um, okay, so let's see. How long have we been going? It's been 40 minutes. Okay. So I do want to add some more stuff into this scene, but I feel like we've already covered a lot. So I'm gonna stop recording for a second and let's